tonight's speaker is Tom Shieber, the senior curator at the Baseball Hall of Fame. Tom's a longtime researcher and contributor to our understanding of the evolution of the game. And in 2018, his years of study were recognized as he received the Henry Chadwick Award from SABR. Tom grew up in St. Louis and received his bachelor's degree from Reed College in physics. So he understands all about the Bernoulli effect and curveballs. After about a decade in physics, Tom joined the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown in 1998. And first, I believe it was webmaster, and ultimately assuming the role of senior curator in 2006. During Tom's tenure at the Hall of Fame, he's developed exhibits on Olympic baseball, Babe Ruth, and a traveling exhibit that toured the country called Baseball in America. With SABR, he founded the Pictorial History Committee in 1994 and has written and presented to SABR groups often throughout his years as a member of the organization. He has delivered a number of talks at the Fred and was a keynote speaker at an earlier conference. Now, if you wish to review an array of wide-ranging baseball essays and research, you can visit his blog titled Baseball Researcher. Just enter Baseball Researcher in your search engine to find it. I believe it's Baseball Researcher, one word, .blogspot something else. But it's a fascinating read and highly detailed, lots of photos and a lot of interesting information. Tonight's topic is Around the World with A.G. Spaulding, the mystery of an 1888-89 tourist diary. I'm going to mute everybody now. Tom, you will unmute and you can bring your screen up as I get the last of the folks in here. And I'll mute everybody. There you go.
All right, is everything working here? We can see, you can hear me?
Yes.
And you're seeing the full slideshow? Bob, you can see it's the full slideshow? Hey, great. All right. Well, thanks very much to Peter and Bob for inviting me to give the talk tonight. Bob, I was a physics major, but that does not mean I have any expertise in curveballs. The only thing I know about curveballs is I can't hit them. So, but thanks for the shout out to my physics background. As noted, I did give an earlier version of this talk at the Fred, but I've updated it and made some changes and different additions here. So I hope for those who have seen this before, you'll still come away with something new and interesting. What I'm going to do is share with you tonight some items from what's really a fantastic collection of artifacts at the Hall of Fame related to what is truly baseball's ultimate road trip. It was originally billed as Spalding's Australian Baseball Tour, and I'll share some research that I've done on some of these objects, and along the way, going to solve a little bit of a mystery regarding one of the items. Now, every image you're going to see tonight, every object, every photo, every document you see is in the collection of the Hall of Fame. That's one of the purposes here, is to sort of show off with this fantastic collection. Everyone except for one, and that is a very special item that is newly discovered that I'll be talking about later this evening. The tour was first announced to the public way back in early spring of 1888, when A.G. Spaulding revealed that after the season ended, he was going to take a pair of teams on an off-season tour from Chicago. He's going to barnstorm west to the West Coast. They're going to go across the Pacific to the Sandwich Islands, which is, of course, now Hawaii, and on to Australia, where they would barnstorm for a couple of months throughout that island nation and then back to the States, going back east across the Pacific. But along the way, the plans changed, and Spaulding decided that he would continue westward and go all the way around the world. Now, what you're looking at right now is the only extant version of a lithograph that promoted that tour, known as Spalding's Australian Baseball Tour. It's about a little over 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, and it features images of the ball players and individuals who were part of the journey. At the top of the illustration are 4 prominent men associated with this tour. Highlighted here is A.G. Spaulding, the former star pitcher, who was at the time of the tour president of the Chicago White Stockings, and of course was founder and owner of the Sporting Goods conglomerate. Cap Anson was clearly one of the top players of the 19th century. All you had to do was stop him on the street and ask him. He would tell you that. He managed and played first base for these touring White Stockings. Johnny Ward was pitcher turned shortstop who was also hired as the player manager of the team that would oppose the White Stockings throughout the tour. They were known as the All-Americas. And Lee Lynch, now that's a name that's probably less familiar to people. He's not a baseball guy. This is a cabinet card in our collection that shows Lee Lynch later on in life. He was previously associated with the Union Square Theater in New York, and most famously was the agent for singer-actress Lily Langtry. But most importantly for A.G. Spaulding's purposes, he was a theatrical agent who was quite familiar with booking acts in Australia. So that was the main thing, was getting a guy who was familiar with that unfamiliar territory for A.G. Spaulding. So in the early months of 1888, Lynch traveled to Australia at the behest of Spaulding and did some advanced work to assess whether it was really viable for this tour to take place. And as it turns out, the answer was yes. And he sent word back to Spaulding saying that was the case. And that's when Spaulding made the official announcement in late March of 1888 saying, hey, when the season's over, we're going to do this. Lynch's job for the tour was basically to be an advance agent. He would, in general, travel a couple of weeks ahead of the tourists, publicizing and promoting and making business arrangements for the tour. Now, after the regular season ended, the tour kicked off with a game at Chicago's West Side Park, home of the White Stockings, on October 20, 1888. And actually, in that game, A.G. Spaulding himself pitched for 4 innings. You got to remember, he had last pitched, 11 years earlier, and that's a decent amount of time, but it's really a decent amount of time when you consider the time frame, because 11 years earlier than 1888, the pitching rules were strikingly different. So he was doing his old form of pitching. He gave up 4 runs in the first, but then he managed to shut the opposition down for 3 more innings. So he actually did surprisingly well. His catcher that day for that kickoff game was King Kelly, who we see here at the left of the center of the poster. Spaulding was keen on getting Kelly to be part of the tour, and so keen that he basically paid him twice as much as any of the other ball players in the tour. The ball players were getting $50 a month plus expenses, but Kelly got twice that. But as it turns out, this game was the only one that Kelly played in the tour, because the day earlier from the game, he announced to Spaulding that he was reneging on the deal and was not going to be able to honor his commitment. 2 other players that we see in this lithograph didn't make the tour as well. One of them is this guy here, Mike Tiernan of the New York Giants. He canceled in mid-October. And Jim Donnelly of Washington, whose mother was ill, and his plan, at least is what he told Spaulding, was that he'd meet up with the ballplaying tourists in San Francisco, but he never did show up. Now, one of the most stunning artifacts in our collection is this diary of the World Tour. We received it in 1997, but at the time, the donor and our library staff was not aware.
Mitch, I'm trying. I'm trying.
Can you guys hear?
Yes, we can hear you, Tom. Somebody's unmuted.
Unmuted. Okay. So it was unsigned, so we didn't know who had written the diary. So I interviewed for the job at the Hall of Fame in early 1998, and our librarian, Jim Gates, at the time shared this with me, and I thought, well, this is really great, and I'm gonna make it a special project of mine to try and figure out who wrote this diary. So
all right, can get me out.
maybe somebody can mute. I'm having a little trouble hearing.
I'm trying. I was
Let me
trying.
get out and go back in again.
So now
You'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. What we'll do here is I'm going to try and figure out who the author was, and as we look through these artifacts, I will sort of take you through the process of how we solve this little mystery. For those of you who have seen this talk before and know who wrote the diary, please don't mention it in the chat session or anything like that. Let's keep it a mystery for everyone as long as we can. This is a page from the initial entry, October 20, 1888, when the tourists departed from Chicago's Union Station, and it's a little difficult to read, so I'll read it real quickly here. In order to further promote the interests of baseball, a few gentlemen from Chicago undertook to establish the national game of America upon foreign soil. Accordingly, on the 20th of October, 1888, they, in company with a number of ball players, reporters, and tourists, left Union Depot on an expedition known as the Spaulding Australian Baseball Tour. A crowd of people collected to see our departure and also to view the newly decorated and handsome sleeping car Galesburg and dining car Cosmopolitan, which were consigned to the party until our arrival in Denver, Colorado. The signal for starting was now heard, and with many farewells and good wishes, the train drew out of the Union Station amid the prolonged cheers of the multitude. Well, beyond the diary, the tour was also well documented by a guy named Harry Palmer, who had quit his job with the Chicago Evening Journal to go on the tour and write for a number of papers. He sent word back to Sporting Life, to the New York Press, Boston Herald, and Chicago Times. And two other newspaper correspondents also went on the tour, the New York Evening Sun's Simon Goodfriend and Newt McMillan of the Chicago Inter-Ocean. So there's a lot of contemporary newspaper coverage that was quite extensive. The following year, Harry Palmer published a 700-page tome, which you're seeing the first couple pages of here, titled Athletic Sports. And it gives a history of sports in America, England, and Australia. And about 2/3 of the book is devoted to baseball. And of that, I would say about 2/3 is devoted to the World Tour. And most of that content he had already written. He just condensed it or reworked it slightly for this book. We have a number of copies of this really wonderful book in the baseball library here at Cooperstown. And there are two modern works about the tour. One is Thomas Seiler's Ambassadors in Pinstripes, and the other is Mark Lamster's Spalding's World Tour. Both of those came out, I believe, in 2006. Mark did a great deal of research at the Hall of Fame, and it was my pleasure and privilege to work with him while I was here in Cooperstown and give him a feel for our collection and share stories. And half a dozen years after the book came out, he was generous enough to donate his research notes. So those are also a great resource that are available here at Cooperstown. Now, the tour lasted exactly 6 months, October 20 to April 20 of 1889. I have far less time to go through the tour. So by necessity, I'm going to be skipping ahead a lot, which is unfortunate because the tour is so rich in great stories. So I got to encourage you, if you don't know very much about it, or even if you do know a lot about it, read Mark Lamster's book. It's just a joy to read. It's a real page turner. It's a lot of fun. And it's a real neat glimpse into not only the baseball, but into traveling around the world in this part of the Victorian era. Now, this is a specially made booklet that served as a menu for those aboard the Cosmopolitan dining car during the week-long trip that it took from Chicago to Denver. The first stop for the tourists was St. Paul, Minnesota. And there, and the next day in Minneapolis, they not only played each other, the White Stockings against the All-Americas, but the White Stockings also played a pair of games against St. Paul of the Western Association. And during those games, the catcher for St. Paul was a guy named Billy Earl, who later became a big leaguer. Well, the Tourists were in need of another catcher because Mike Kelly had dropped out. So Spalding signed up Billy Earl to continue on with them around the world. Well, at that point, it was in Australia and back. Now, the first page of the booklet that I showed you gets a list of organizers and managers of the tour there on the left side, as well as the ball players. So now there's lots of other people that were part of the entourage, but this is the ball playing and executive group. Except there's one person that's missing, and that is Hall of Famer George Wright, who went on the tour. And his job was to be the umpire. But really, the other part of his job was to be a cricket coach, because when they were in Australia, they were going to be playing a decent amount of cricket as well as baseball. So I don't know why his name was left off this list, but it was. Now, of the ball players that are listed, King Kelly had already dropped out, like I mentioned. Jim Donnelly never showed up in the Bay Area. And additionally, two other people, John Ward and Ed Cannonball Crane, who both played for the New York Giants, they were busy playing in the postseason World Championship against the St. Louis Browns. So they didn't join the tour until late October, when the series was over, and they joined them in Denver. But the purpose of this is we'll use this inside cover as sort of a scorecard for trying to keep track of who could possibly have written the diary. So first of all, we know that the author of the diary was with the tourists from the beginning in Chicago, because I read you that entry from when they left Union Station. So we can now cross up the names of King Kelly and Jim Donnelly and John Ward and Cannonball Crane. And also we can cross off Billy Earl, except he's not listed here because he joined up when they got to St. Paul. So, but he couldn't have possibly written the diary either, because he wasn't there when they left in Chicago. In October 22 of 1888, the tourist stint in Minneapolis, there's an entry in the diary that says, the train started early this morning from Minneapolis and arrived there in about half an hour. Mr. Spaulding kindly invited us to a carriage drive, which we accepted, and spent some time looking at the sights of the city. In the afternoon, we played ball to a large attendance. So once again, referring to our scorecard, the diarist mentioned that Spaulding invited us to a carriage driver. This isn't the situation like Ricky Henderson referring to himself in the third person. So we know that Spaulding is not one of the diarists, so we can cross him off of the list. A couple days later, written in the diary is, arrived in Omaha about 9 a.m. Spent a few hours looking about the city, and in the afternoon paraded to the park and displayed our talents to a very large crowd. From this, and actually many entries throughout the diary, it's clear that the author of the diary is one of the ball players, not one of the rest of the entourage. So given that, we can cross off names like Lee Lynch, the business manager Harry Simpson, who was also sometimes a bit ahead of the tour and had played a little bit of ball in Newark, as well as George Wright, who was not playing baseball, but he's not on this but on this list anyway. So we were making some good progress here in eliminating individuals. Additionally, on October 25th, while they're playing in Omaha, Spalding was in Kansas City, and he signed outfielder Jimmy Manning of the Kansas City Blues to join the tour. A lot of last-second signings. Now, he's not on the earlier on my scorecard here, because that was a signing partway through the tour. But obviously, he's not the author either. So if his name was here, we would cross it off. So skipping ahead, we're now in California. And November 8th, the diarist says, arrived in Stockton this morning and played against the local talent. A fair-sized audience witnessed the contest, which was close and exciting. But what happened that day was actually the two teams, White Stockings and the All-Americans, split. And the White Stockings played against Stockton in Stockton. The All-Americans played a different game against the Pioneers in San Francisco. So since our author mentions that he played the Stockton game, then he had to be a member of the White Stockings, which quickly eliminates everybody on the All-Americans. So we're making just stunningly good progress, and I'm only like a couple minutes into this thing. So we're doing really great. Now, after a couple weeks in California, they played games, by the way, in San Francisco, in Oakland, in Stockton, but they went as far south as Los Angeles to play as well. But after about 2 weeks, they prepared for their sea voyage. and they were on board the SS Alameda of the Oceanic Steam Line. And it was bound for the Sandwich Islands, then it would go to New Zealand and Australia, and then it would come back. And the Alameda did it for a number of years, just did that route over and over. And this is the passenger list of the SS Alameda for that voyage. If you open it up, on the right side of the list is the list of passengers who were going to go all the way to Australia. On the left side are people who would disembark either in Honolulu or in Auckland. So if you take a look at the list on the right side, you can see there's names like Cap Anson and Ned Williamson who are traveling with their wives. H.E. Spalding is traveling with his mother, Harriet, who we will see a little bit later on. Johnny Ward is listed as traveling with his wife, the actress Helen Dovray. But in Salt Lake City, she opted to return to New York, so she didn't actually go on the sea voyage. The marriage was on the rocks, and they finally did divorce in 1893. And you also see on the list is Mike Kelly and wife. Spalding still held out hopes that Kelly would rejoin the tour and was pressuring him to do so. First in Denver, and when that didn't happen, he tried to get him to come to San Francisco, but Kelly never budged. Spalding's hopes were dashed, and it was too late to alter the passenger list at that point. Now, originally the ship was scheduled to leave San Francisco on November 17th, but the departure was delayed a day for a mail shipment. So they got off a day late, and that's too much time to make up on the sea. So they arrived 1 day late in Honolulu, and the problem is they arrived on Sunday, November 25, not Saturday morning, November 24. And despite valiant efforts on Spalding's part, the island's blue laws were strictly enforced. And so a doubleheader that was scheduled to be played on Saturday couldn't be played on Sunday, and they never did play baseball in Hawaii. Still, they managed to have a good time in Hawaii. Who's not going to have a good time in Hawaii? And they attended a number of different events, but including a luau that was thrown by the reigning king, King Kala'aua, who's the last reigning king of Hawaii. And this is an illustration that is in the book, Athletic Sports, has a couple of color plates in it. Now, before the group left San Francisco, Spalding had actually revised his original plan to go to Australia and back, and was seriously considering continuing west and going around the world. And you got to remember, this is 1888. Well, just 16 years earlier, Jules Verne published Around the World in 80 Days. This was still a sort of a grand concept that was quite extravagant. And Spalding had just a little bit of an ego, and he couldn't resist the idea of going around the world. But he still had to sell the idea to the ball players. His concern, though, was if he revealed it while they were still in San Francisco, that a bunch of guys would jump contract and not continue on. He had already had that problem without telling anybody about going on westward around the world. So he kept the plan secret, and he waited until everybody was on board ship and off the coast of California. He literally had a captive audience, but he was still a little bit concerned about how to reveal this information to the players. So what he did is he got some Confederates, specifically Harry Palmer and John Ward, and a couple other people. Cap Anson knew about this because Cap Anson had money in on the project. And he orchestrated having these Confederates sort of slowly leak out the rumors of the possibility that they might do this. And they sort of took the temperature of how people reacted. Well, the ball players reacted very favorably. So Spalding felt really good about that. Still, it wasn't until the group was all in Melbourne. I mean, they first go to Sydney and they're traveling around the country. It wasn't until about a month later in Melbourne that he made the official announcement that, you know what, we're not going to go back across the Pacific. We're going to continue on around the world. So after they left Hawaii, they went to New Zealand and Australia. And I noticed something interesting about the list of passengers here. If you look on the left side at the bottom for Auckland, there's a gentleman named O.D. Romney. Well, this is Orson Douglas Romney, who was a Mormon missionary on his way to New Zealand. His grandfather is a fellow named Miles Romney. And Miles Romney is the great-great-grandfather of former presidential candidate and current Senator Mitt Romney. So this guy here, who is with the baseball tourists, is first cousins twice removed with Mitt Romney. So back to the tour. I know we love to talk politics, but we're not going to do that tonight. After a couple of days in New Zealand, the SS Alameda left for Australia and arrived in Sydney on Friday, December 14th. And that evening, the tourists attended what was called the Grand American Gala Night at the Theatre Royal, where they saw a husband and wife duo of J.C. Williamson and Maggie Moore in a play that was extremely successful for many, many years in Australia called Struck Oil. And this is a program from that evening. While they were in Australia, the All-Americas and Chicago teams posed for this photograph. It's a little bit of a mystery exactly where it was taken. It's either Sydney or Melbourne. But what's really amazing about this photo is something that you see on the ground. This is a close-up. So on the left side is a Wagon Tongue Bat, very popular bat that was first introduced early in 1888. So it's a new bat at that time. But it was a mainstay of the Spalding sporting goods company for many, many years. But on the right side, lower down, you can see a very different bat, and that is an 8-sided bat. Now, from 1885 through 1892 inclusive, it was legal in Major League rules for a bat to have, quote, a portion of the surface flat on one side. But it would have been illegal to have it flat on multiple sides. And that's what this bat is. It's an 8-sided bat that was the invention of actually a baseball writer named Bob Larner, who pitched this idea of experimenting with the bat to Spalding before he left on the tour. And Larner actually wrote about this in the Sporting Life in October. He said, quote, Mr. Spaulding, to whom I explained my idea and furnished him a rudely constructed model, proposes to experiment with the octagonal bat during the Australian trip. He will have a number of these bats constructed in his own manufactory, and the members of the Chicago and All-America teams will give them a practical test. This is the only known photo of this unique bat style, and it's not clear at all how much it was experimented with, except that I can tell you it didn't catch on. Now, on January 8th of the following year, 1889, they had already played about 3 weeks of baseball and cricket in Australia. And that's when the tourists left Melbourne on this ship, the SS SABR, part of the Nordischer Lloyd line. And it bound not back for the States, but further west. They went to Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, and then on to Aden in the country of Yemen. This is a menu card from that ship. And here's a cabinet card showing that very steamer, the SABR, which less than a decade later, in December of 1896, wrecked off the coast of Spain and killed all 300 people on board. Also on the trip was John Tenner, who was a member of the tourists, and he was actually added. Spalding gave him an extra job during the tour, and that was to act as secretary and cashier for the tour, and he got extra pay for that. And that was a pretty important job, but obviously the money was critical, but given the constant change in currency, that was a real challenge. Tenner proved to be really good at this, and actually that went a long way towards his post-baseball playing career, because he went into banking after his baseball playing career. Furthermore, he was later a congressman from the state of Pennsylvania. He was governor of Pennsylvania, and he was president of the National League for 5 years. Maybe 6 years. Now, he wrote this letter while aboard that SS SABR, and he talks about his what happened in Australia, et cetera, et cetera. But what's really important for me was to take a look at the handwriting, and it was clearly quite different than the handwriting in the diary. So, referring to our scorecard, I knew I could cross off John Tenner. Eventually, the tourists arrive in Cairo. I'm really skipping ahead. So it's February 7th. They were in Cairo. These are a couple images that come from the book Athletic Sports. There's lots of non-baseball images of people and places that they saw. And the next evening, Cap Anson and his wife decided to go out for the night on the town, and they had a bit of a misadventure. They hired a driver to drive around in Cairo, and they happened upon what looked like to Cap Anson a very promising building. And he asked the driver where they were, and I guess the driver understood enough English. He really didn't speak hardly any English at all, but he understood enough English, and he said something that Cap Anson thought he was saying circus. But it's more likely what the cab driver was saying was Sirdaria, because they were actually at the home of a guy named Major General Francis Wallace Grenfell, who was the Sirdar, or what's known as the British Commander-in-Chief of the Egyptian Army. But Cap Anson thinks it's a circus, and he's like, yeah, I'm up for a circus. And so he enters the mansion, and he bumps into, by dumb luck, he actually bumps into the Sirdar himself, and he says, hey, where are the tickets to the circus? And so Grenfell says, yeah, this is my private home. This is a private party. So Anson is very embarrassed, and he excuses himself and his wife, and they get back into the cab, and they will return to the hotel before they can do any more damage. And Anson later notes in his autobiography, quote, Mrs. Anson, who'd been laughing at me all the way back, had, of course, to tell the story, meaning to everybody else. And the result being that I was guyed about my experience at the circus for some days and weeks after Cairo had become only a memory. Well, this is a wonderful story, but there's no mention of the story in the diary, and certainly he would have mentioned it. So it's pretty easy to conclude that Cap Anson is not a potential diarist. On Saturday, February 9th, the diarist said, quote, a gala day for us and a ride to the Sphinx and pyramids arranged. About 10 o'clock in the morning, we mounted on the backs of camels and donkeys and had a group photograph taken in front of the hotel. So here is that photograph in front of the Hotel d'Orient with some of the players on camels and some of the players on donkeys. And each of the crew was jealous of the other. So they halfway through, they said, okay, switch, because the grass was greener on the other animal. And and they're equally unhappy on the other animal as well. It's a fairly miserable ride out to the Sphinx and the pyramids. So the first stop for the tourists was the Sphinx, where they had this photo taken, and they played a game to see who could throw a ball and hit the Sphinx in the eye. Hey, ugly Americans. So that's Albert Spaulding right here at the center. And to his right, our left, this woman here in black is his mother, Harriet. Okay, so afterwards, they laid out a very rudimentary diamond on what's the ultimate sand lot, the desert of the Giza Plateau. And they played a game of baseball there. Now, you know that this is a really stupid idea, because once a ball hits the sand, it's just going to go nowhere. It's incredibly difficult to run in the sand, let alone slide in the sand. It's going to be a terrible ball game. And in fact, it was a pretty bad ball game. And of course, nobody all the Bedouins that are around there have no clue what is going on. But you know what? Spalding knew this as well, but he also knew that it was going to be a great photo op. And he was right. Here we are, what is this, 130 something years later, and we're still looking at this photo and the Sphinx. So Spalding got it right. This baseball was one of George Wright's keepsakes from the World Tour, and it was used in the game at the pyramids. And over 50 years later, George Wright's son, Irving, donated this ball along with a number of other wonderful items in Wright's stunning collection, as you might guess, to the Hall of Fame. And inscribed on it is "Ball played with in game at Pyramids, Egypt." The tourists arrived in Brindisi in Italy on February 15th, and the next day they headed a couple hundred miles west to Naples, where they played their first game in Europe. And when they were in Rome, it was said that Spalding offered as much, or he was willing to offer as much as £1,000. That's $5,000 of 1889 money for the use of the Coliseum to play a baseball game. But he was told by everyone that you can't do that. Now, he thought what they meant was that you may not do that, and he just thought, well, I'll just keep pressing. I'll talk to diplomats. I'll talk to this person, that person. He didn't understand it was not a matter of may. It's actually you cannot do it because there is no surface on which to play in the Coliseum. It's just full of gaping holes at the bottom where you can see the inner workings. It's kind of cool, but it really was impossible. You cannot play baseball in the Coliseum. It's also incredibly rude to try and do so, even if it was doable. But it was just an outrageous request which is not out of the ordinary for A.G. Spalding. But as a small consolation, a couple days later, they took him to the Coliseum along with the rest of the ball players and the entourage. And they showed him the Coliseum and how, this is why you can't play here. But they brought with them a photographer and they took a great photo, which you can see here. Then they went out and they played a baseball game at Villa Borghese, which is just about 2 miles north of the Coliseum. When they made it to Paris, they visited this structure, which when I first saw this picture, which is in the book Athletic Sports, I thought, wow, they kind of should have pulled back a little bit so you can see the whole thing. This is the entire Eiffel Tower at the time that they visited. It was being built. If you look very carefully at the top, that's scaffolding. They had not completed it by any means. So it was really quite a stunning little view of an incomplete Eiffel Tower. They played a game on March 8th of 1889 at Parc Aerostatique, which is within sight of the Eiffel Tower. And at that game was Pierre de Coubertin, who that very year forwarded the idea of reviving the Olympic Games. And today, Coubertin is heralded as the father of the modern Olympic movement. Well, he witnessed the baseball game played in Paris by the tourists. Now, in that game, White Sox shortstop Ned Williamson injured himself attempting to steal second base. He cut his knee very badly, had to be helped from the field, and later on the wound became infected. And that basically ended his ability to play on the tour, but he accompanied the tourists for the rest of their time throughout Europe and back to the States. But not only did it end his time on the tour, it essentially ended his career. He did make it back to the States and he did play 2 more years, but only very partial seasons. So he never really did recover from that injury in Paris. Well, that incident is not mentioned in the diary. And furthermore, the diarist clearly played baseball games after Paris, and Williamson did not. So we can cross Ned Williamson off of our scorecard. So they took a rather rough trip across the English Channel, and the tourists prepared for an extended stay in England and Ireland. And in the collection of the hall, as all of these items are, is this ticket to a baseball exhibition that took place on March 12th at the Oval in Kennington, which is still there and is still the home of the Surrey County Cricket Club, has been since 1845. So take that, Fenway. As noted on the card, His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, that's Albert, Prince of Wales, who would later become King Edward VII, attended the game. Apparently he's kind of a Dodger fan because he came in the 2nd inning and left in like the 7th or 8th inning. But he did stay for about an hour of the eventual 7-3 White Stockings victory. Also in attendance was arguably the greatest cricketer in English history, W.G. Grace. That's a big deal. This is a picture that was taken that same day, right before the ball game. Ned Williamson is nowhere to be seen because he's at the hotel recuperating. There's A.G. Spalding and George Wright with a baseball in his hand, and the world tourists surrounding him. There's Cap Anson right there, Fred Pfeffer. There's John Tenner. On March 16th, the teams played their final London area contest. This time it was at the Leighton Cricket Ground, which was at the time the home of the Essex County Cricket Club. And that evening in York Street in London, the tourists visited the Niagara Cyclorama, which is a giant 50-foot high, 400-foot in circumference painting of Niagara Falls. And the scene was painted by French artist Paul Philippetot, who was the same guy who just half a dozen years earlier in 1883 had created the famous cyclorama of the Battle of Gettysburg, which is still, if you go to Gettysburg, you can still see it. But this was the menu for that banquet that was a very special banquet for the tourists near the cyclorama. This is a specially printed schedule for the London and Northwestern Railway. It was outfitted especially for the party, 2 special dining cars, 2 smoking cars, and 5 sleepers. And on the exterior of each of those cars were affixed the words, "The American Baseball Clubs." As you can see here, the tourists made stops in Birmingham, in Sheffield, Bradford, they're just going way north, Glasgow, came back down to Manchester and Liverpool, and at Fleetwood, where they headed off to Ireland. And here is a picture of that train. And if you look very closely, you can see the words, the American Baseball Clubs, plastered across some of these cars. So skipping ahead to the trip in Ireland, on March 28th, the tourists took a quick trip to the Blarney Castle, where lots of them kissed the Blarney Stone, and then they went back to Cork, took a railway trip to Queenstown, which is now known as Cove, and on to the steamer Adriatic, which is the flagship of the White Star Line, for a 9-day trip back, well, not back, but across the Atlantic to New York. Queenstown, which, as I mentioned, is now called Cove, is, of course, the same port from which the White Star Line's famous Titanic departed some 23 years later. This is a saloon passenger list from that voyage. So the Adriatic reached New York early on the morning of April 6th. And later that day, the ballplayers visited Washington Park in Brooklyn to watch a preseason exhibition game between New York and Brooklyn. And 2 days later, the clubs once again attended a game at Washington Park, but this time they came in full uniform and ready for well-known Brooklyn photographer Joseph Hall to capture their likenesses. And so this is a photograph of the All-Americas. That's John Ward at center right here. That evening, April 8th, 1889, the tourists were treated to the most extravagant dinner thrown in their honor. And they were feted wherever they went. They were always going to these extravagant dinners, especially in Europe and throughout the States. This event took place at Delmonico's, which was absolutely unquestionably the restaurant in New York City for such an affair. And this is the silk-tied ribbon. And if, for those who noticed, we had one person who was tuning into the talk and had this as their background. So thank you, Carrie, for doing that. So this is actually ballplayer George Wood's program from the event. And his name is written in the very thick golden ink on the front. And a little shout out to our Canadian contingent that always tunes into these things. Wood was from Prince Edward Island, and he's one of only 3 major leaguers born in the province. And he was a 2011, he's in the 2011 Hall of Fame class of the Canadian Baseball Hall. So on the inside, you've got the list of toasts. Over 300 people attended the celebration. They paid $10 a plate. That's like almost $300 today. A full orchestra played throughout the evening, and they did, starting at 10 o'clock, they had the whole speaking portion of the festivities. And in attendance were big names, guys like A.G. Mills, who's nationally president, Mark Twain, DeWolf Hopper, who first recited Casey the Bat just a couple months before the tourists left. So he's the guy, of course, who made Casey the Bat famous. Teddy Roosevelt, Henry Chadwick, among other people. Now, our collection includes a number of volumes of correspondence with A.G. Mills, and a number of those pages relate to the World Tour because Mills was in charge of organizing this Delmonico's dinner. And this is a great letter written to the proprietors of the Murray Hill Hotel. And it says, "There will come to your house from Hartford on Monday 2 gentlemen, Mr. Samuel L. Clemens, Mark Twain, and the Reverend J.H., that's Joseph Hopkins Twitchell. These gentlemen will be our guests at the banquet at Delmonico's Monday evening, and we want to arrange with you to not allow them to pay any hotel bill. Mark Twain will probably make a kick at this, but let him kick." The ball clubs barnstormed their way back to Chicago with events all along the way. But they had to get there quickly because opening day was April 24th. So they had a hard and fast deadline, sort of like Phileas Fogg did in Around the World in 80 Days. They had a hard and fast deadline, but they had longer than 80 days. So they had exhibition games and banquets in Brooklyn, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Boston, Washington, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Indianapolis, and then Chicago. Now this is a menu from the April 11th, 1889 Sporting Life reception. It was put on by Sporting Life, the newspaper published in Philadelphia, and it took place at the Hotel Bellevue in Philadelphia. Now, earlier I teased you about a special item, the only object you're going to see tonight that is not in the collection of the Hall of Fame. I wish it were. And that is this. It's sheet music. And this is the only known copy of Spalding's Baseball Tourists Around the World Grand March, which is published in the spring of 1889 and composed by a guy named Fred T. Baker, who was actually a very well-known composer in Philadelphia. This is in the sheet music collection of Notre Dame's Rare Books and Special Collections. My best guess, because there's hardly any reference to this in any paper, it's basically just a couple of advertisements that happened in April. My best guess is this music was either played at the April 11th Sporting Life reception or perhaps at the ballpark that day. It's also my theory that it was not just the first time it was played, but probably the last time it was played. Like I said, there's just a couple of advertisements for the sheet music, and then it disappears from the face of the earth, and nobody's heard about it until the discovery this summer. So as far as I'm aware, I think it's very safe to say that this tune has not been played in a public setting since April of 1889. And it really may not have been played in a public or private setting because it clearly didn't sell very well, if at all. Like I said, it's the only known copy, and there's only about 3 advertisements known. But tonight, we're going to end that streak of over 130 years of silence, and we're going to hear Spalding's Baseball Tourists Around the World Grand March. Now, Bob, I need you to give me a thumbs up. Can you hear this, Bob? Okay, that also might be the last time that's played for another 130 years, but I'm glad to have shared it with you tonight. So 3 days later, the diarist writes, left Boston at 3:30 p.m. en route for Washington, left Pettit, that's Bob Pettit, at home in Meriden, Connecticut. Well, we can now take a look at our scorecard and cross off Bob Pettit. And the final stop of the tour was Chicago. And on the evening of April 19th, the tourists had one more grand entertaining evening, this time at Chicago's famed Palmer House. And if you guys went, if any of you went to the SABR convention in Chicago back in 2015, it was held at the same location. It's now called Palmer House Hilton. This is a beautiful silk-covered menu card from that evening's affair. And if you open it up, you see this wonderful, just fantastic artwork. The following day, the clubs played their last exhibition game. And for those interested, for the games played between All-Americans in Chicago, because especially in the U.S., they would do some games against other teams. As I mentioned, St. Paul was one. The final record was the All-Americans won 29 games, the Chicagos won 23 games, and there were 4 ties. So we've come to the end of the tour, and we've eliminated the vast majority of people on the scorecard, and we're left with half a dozen potential authors. Tom Burns, Fred Pfeffer, Tom Daly, Mark Baldwin, Marty Sullivan, and Jimmy Ryan. And it was at this point in 1998, when I first did my research in the diary, that I was at an impasse, and I decided, though, to utilize the world's best baseball library, the National Baseball Library in Cooperstown, to look for handwriting samples. I thought, well, that's kind of the brute force way to do it. Let's try that. And happily, I came across a letter from our collection that was written to Cincinnati Reds owner Gary Herman in August of 1905. Now, that's 17 years after the diary was written. But I want you to take a look at this. The top portion of the screen is a letter that I found. The bottom portion is part of the diary. So if you take a look, capital G is very similar in its structure, and also the open looped O that seems to almost be crossed in the middle, almost like a Greek phi, are very, very similar. There's other similarities as well. I won't bore you with all of those. And of course, there's differences, but you have to allow for potentially a 17-year, what is 17 years between the two handwriting samples. People's handwriting does change. But there was enough that was close to make me feel like this was a very good lock on this. And the diarist was Jimmy Ryan. Now, I felt really good about that being the case when I first announced that to the colleagues in Cooperstown back in '98, but I got final confirmation from actually a surprising source. And that was in 2001, 3 years later. Mastro Auctions featured a diary, and the lot described it as follows, quote, lot number 10, James Ryan, 1888-1889, Spalding World Tour Handwritten Journal. This incredible journal is the handwritten account kept by Chicago White Sox outfielder James Ryan during his historic trip with A.T. Spalding's World Tour of 1888-1889. This is a phenomenal, one-of-a-kind historical record which simply must be read in its entirety to be fully appreciated. And this is an image from the catalog. I think it's just hilarious that Master Auctions said this is a one-of-a-kind historical record, when in fact it's not only not a one-of-a-kind historical thing, it's not the only diary kept by Jimmy Ryan, apparently. Now, when I first heard about the auction, I got very confused. I said, how can there be two Jimmy Ryan diaries? And then I compared what was written in the diary that we have with on what's written in the diary pages that they reproduce on their website, on the Mastro website. And I found out that they were nearly identical, but not quite identical. So one thing you need to know about the diary that I was showing you for most of the talk is that it has numerous words and phrases either crossed out or changed or other words added. The auction diary doesn't have those marks at all. It's pretty pristine. So the diary that was auctioned off by Mastro in 2001 was not, quote, kept by him during his historic trip. It was after his historic trip. The diary that's at the Hall of Fame is the one that he took around the world. When he got back, he edited it, made markings on that diary, and then he rewrote the diary, and that is what Mastro auctioned off. For those who are curious, the auction was for $22,000. But for me, the most important thing was it was confirmation that the diary was indeed written by Jimmy Ryan, because the one that was auctioned off by Mastro was in fact signed by Jimmy Ryan. So Ryan's final entry in his diary, and I'm showing you our version, is the final entry in my presentation. It reads as follows. Saturday, April 20th, today we've completed the circumference of the globe. For 6 months ago today, we bid goodbye to Chicago and entered upon our tour around the world. We have given exhibitions of our national game in every continent on the face of the globe. Apparently South America and the Antarctic don't count to Jimmy. And also in 13 foreign countries, and traveled upward of a distance of 30,000 miles. This afternoon, as tourists, we played our last game, and a great crowd greeted us as we appeared upon our native diamond. The game concluded, and so also did the greatest trip in the annals of sport, namely a baseball tour around the world. Fini. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Tom, there have been a couple that came up on chat. Brad Cooper asked if there were any players who declined Spalding's invitation to go on the tour. There have been several comments subsequent to that there were, including some listed in Lamster's book. Are you aware of any particular declinations of the invitation?
No, I can't recall that, but if Mark's got it, it's almost assuredly true. So yeah, definitely look at Mark's book.
The names that were put up here were Comiskey, Carruthers, Bid McPhee, and the like. Fairly good names that were
right.
Invited to promote the tour. There was also a question on Comiskey's connection. Let me find that real quick here from Jacob. If this was the idea that formed in Comiskey's mind to try his own world tour, or at least think about his own world tour in the teens with John McGraw.
So I'm sorry, what was the question?
They want Jacob was asking if Comiskey's, at least a tentative connection with this, if this was sort of the propulsion for his idea of a world tour in the teens, 1912, 1930, somewhere in there, with John McGraw.
Right. So the tour that McGraw and Comiskey did in, I want to say 1914, 13, 14, something like that, was in they overtly did talk about the anniversary, 25th anniversary of the 1888-89 World Tour. So, and they specifically decided to go to many of the same locales even. So they did go in that later tour to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. They did go to Paris, I believe, and I think much of what happened in Europe was similar. So they very consciously did riff off of this world tour, no question.
And the last comment of some note from Matt Alberson, when he was listening to the recording, he had just discovered his new ringtone.
Well, you're gonna have to go to Notre Dame and get that sheet music.
Tom, thank you very much for your effort, your presentation, and the information that was there. With lots of claps and waves coming through from the muted audience. Thank you very much. Peter, we'll turn it back to you to close this evening's festivities.
Yes, thank you, Tom. You really did a fabulous job, and I saw those comments come up in the chat telling you how fantastic it was.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm glad nobody divulged it. If you remembered, it was Jimmy Ryan. I want to say just a few more words about our series coming up. Next month, we're going to be blessed here with Don Jensen, who happens to be on this evening. And Don will be doing a presentation on one of our favorite people when we go to the ballpark, Harry Stevens, the hot dog king. And we'll talk about his 19th century origins and his way up in the business of catering. I also want to mention that our March presentation will be Jerry Casway, and he'll be doing a presentation on Lipman Pike. Before Greenberg, there was Pike. And that'll be fascinating. I know Jerry's a pretty dynamic presenter. I want to add the two names of the presenters for April and May. We finally finalized that for this first premier season of this 19th century conferences. And that's Chip Martin. There's two Chip Martins in SABR, but this is Chip Martin up in Canada, who's going to be doing the presentation that he did a few years ago at the Fred about the Detroit Wolverines and how they kidnapped their way to the pennant. I think it was 1887, I believe. And then on May 11th, the final one of the season will be Alan Cohn, who did an excellent presentation a few years ago at the Fred called Never on Sunday. And it has to do with baseball's battle with the Blue Laws. So that'll be our wrap up. What we intend to do is take June, July, August off. This is something Bob and I had discussed. And we're going to start maybe a second season of this coming around to next September. So it'll be like kind of a academic year in a sense. And we'll do it that way. I also want to mention, if as a commercial, the 2021 Fred is essentially almost exactly the identical program that had been scheduled in 2020 but had to be canceled. So I want you to know that now, right now, as per January 4th, I believe it was, or the 6th rather, when our newsletter came out, you can now, for people who haven't been to the Fred before or would like to go this year, you can register online on the SABR website for the Frederick Iver Candle Conference. It'll be done virtually. It is $35. It'll begin on Thursday evening from 8 p.m. Eastern time till about 10. And then it'll resume for most of the day on both Friday and Saturday. And that'll kind of replicate it. And you could take a look at our winter newsletter, which just came out recently, 19th Century Committee winter newsletter. And it'll give you the program and the schedule of the events and how to register. Okay, I want to thank Tom again. Bob, thank you again for all the background work. There's some background work that goes into this, and Bob does it. And he does a great job with it. Thank you, Tom, again.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Tom, Mrs. Mitch, I have a question.
Sure.
Yes.
The way you did the presentation at the end, you showed like a cover, like with your name on the bottom with the big picture on. Is that available for sale?
You mean the picture of the ball players in front of the pyramids?
Yeah, it looks like something that you put down, and then I forget, because it was one of the last presentations you showed.
Your
Is it like in
opening
book
and closing
form? Is it
slide.
something that can be purchased?
The opening and closing slides where I have the title and my little presentation by Tom Shieber at the bottom is just
Yes, yes.
Yeah, that's a PowerPoint slide. I mean, it's based on a photograph that is in the collection of the Baseball Hall of Fame.
Oh,
The photograph doesn't have the words "Around the World" or Tom Shieber on it.
no,
But,
no, I understand. I thought maybe it was a book form. I could purchase it at a sports. Store.
No. Nope. But the image is available for purchase from the Baseball Hall of Fame, and I don't know what our prices are. I don't work in the photo department, but they're very cheap. I can tell you that they're really inexpensive, and you get a really nice quality image. And the happy thing about it is it's in the public domain.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Tom.
Yes, Dixie.
Hello.
Hello.
3 things about your program. It was terrific. Absolutely terrific.
Don't complain about my piano playing. Because it wasn't me.
Fine with me.
We didn't write him his check yet, so don't.
The first thing that you showed of the ball players being listed for those who were going on the tour.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed that Herman Long's name was there, and he never went anywhere.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. There was a situation with Herman Long. I believe he was scheduled to go, and he backed out, but I can't recall, and I don't know if I have Mark Lamser's book right here because I keep it at arm's length at all times. And
But I noticed that his name was on the first list, but the very second list you showed of the guys on the ship, he was already gone. So
yeah, I think that he was only
right
going. I think he was only going to the West Coast. Actually, another one that was like that I didn't mention is a guy who played for for the Giants, who I'm embarrassed. I'm going to miss this. George Van Haltren. George Van Haltren also. He went with the tourists all the way out to the Bay Area because he's from San Francisco, but he had never intended. He just said, "I'll help out on the Western swing, but that's as far as I'm going." I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of these guys who backed out partway through backed out because they were concerned about being seasick.
Yes, I'm sure they did.
That was a big
as for Jimmy Ryan, he's from Massachusetts. So when the convention was in Chicago, I went out purposely to find his grave, which is northernmost Chicago, right next to the Evanston line along the lake, same cemetery as Comiskey, but it's a totally unmarked grave. Complete, just grass. That's all there is there.
That's a shame. Up until Ricky, before Ricky Henderson, you could make an argument that Jimmy Ryan was the greatest left-handed throwing right-handed batter. Can't be a switch hitter. of all time. I mean, he really is a great player who lived in the shadows of Cap Anson.
And he pitched a few games too, just because they needed him to pitch. The last question I have is, do you know the relationship between John K. Tenner and George Wood?
No, you got me, but
George
Dixie, you do.
Wood died in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, because he was the sergeant at arms of the State House, because Tenner gave him that job because of the tour that they went on and became great friends. That's where he died.
But now we've really come full circle. So I'll have to add that to the talk next time I give it. Thank you, Dixie. That's awesome. That's incredible.
George Wood is buried in Franklin, Massachusetts, because his wife was from there. But it was a big ceremony of him dying in Philadelphia, in Harrisburg, because he had that job that Tenner gave him, and then being transported back to Franklin, Mass. So that's
Right.
where he is now.
Say,
And
Tom,
that
I have
grave's unmarked too.
I have a more general question. Whenever I write about Adrian Anson, I never know how best to refer to him. I mean, usually it's Cap. Later it was Pop. When did he become Cap, or how was he referred to at different times?
Yeah, I think it's a Pop is real common, and during his playing career, and of course he was known as Baby Anson early on there, but I always call him Cap. Mostly, it's not so much historically accurate, but that way I can tell people know who I'm talking about. It's the same thing with Grover Cleveland Alexander. I mean, at the time everybody called him Pete Alexander, but now for whatever reason people know him as Grover Cleveland Alexander. So I guess I could call him Pete Alexander, but I'm gonna lose a lot of people, and they're not gonna know who I'm talking about. So Cap Anson is what people know, and so if I need to explain, I say Cap Anson. But the other thing you should know about Cap Anson is I mentioned the story about him being flustered at the circus. You read anything about Cap Anson contemporaneously, and the guy's kind of a buffoon, and he's very full of himself. And so, here he is. It's good natured of him that he kind of took this ribbing that his wife was giving him, and then all the rest of the ball players were giving him. But the ball players gave him ribbing all the time about everything, because he was really full of himself. So that wasn't really unusual. It's just an excuse with this circus deal.
Typical Philly guy.
Several of us prefer Baby Hanson.
Yeah, Baby Hanson's pretty good.
Yeah. He became captain of the White Stockings in 1879. And I think that's when he became known as Cap. When I did a bunch of research on him, I found that out. So it was 1879.
I've looked through hundreds of game accounts. Never saw Anson with the word with CAP in front of his name. Yeah. It's long after he retired.
Yeah.
Captain A.C. Anson. You see the most often, A.C. Anson.
Yeah. You know what? That's a really good point, Bob.
But Cap, not until after retired.
Same thing with Spalding. I mean, Spalding is almost universally called AG. It was basically during his career, nobody was calling him Al Spalding or Albert Spalding. It's AG. And so that one, I went with AG on this, but yeah. If I were to say Pop Anson or A.C. Anson, it would be a little confusing, but it'd probably be more correct.
I've seen Uncle Anson as well in the 1890s.
Lots of times, Uncle Anson, yes.
Well, I've referred to him often as Captain with abbreviated CAPT dot Adrian Anson. I figure it covers it. And that people will know who it is. And
Yep.
Hey, Tom, fantastic presentation. And I want to thank Bob and Peter for continuing this. Really helps keep our committee together, and it really sets it apart from others, I think. Terrific work, everybody.
I just joined for the first time. I had a very good time.
Had a good evening. We'll see you again in a month from now at the second Tuesday when Mr. Jensen will regale us with he also is bringing the food that week, so just come right on along. It's going to be a little hard to grab it, but it'll be on his table. Thank you all. Have a good evening.
All right. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Jimmy Ryan, we know is in an unmarked grave, and we got him on our hit parade.
Mhm.
Well, this better push him over to the top, and he better be the next guy, right?
Good
Almost.
night, all.
I
Good
just
night.
wanted to say something. You mentioned Herman Long, Jimmy Ryan, George Van Houten. These are guys that probably the very beginning of their careers and probably are maybe afraid to embark on such an ambitious tour. Maybe that's why they didn't go.
Well, Jimmy Ryan went all the way.
He did, but Herman Long didn't. Jimmy Ryan did, yeah. A number of people, they started their careers in the late 1880s. Maybe they were just afraid.
Well, Herman Long was in the minor leagues those 2 years. He hadn't even gotten to Boston yet.
Yeah, and there's actually a guy like Billy Earl had not played any major ball, and this actually was a good way to get his foot in the door to show off what he can do, and he got a major league career with.
A lot of these guys started their careers in the late 1880s.
Yeah.
But also having Herman Long on that first list shows you how important he was before he made it to Boston. And his notoriety of being able to play shortstop was already out there. That they asked him to go on this trip without him even playing a game yet in the majors.
Yeah.
Well, I would like to point out. I'd like to point out that there were no American Association players on the tour. Only National Leaguers and minor leaguers.
Yeah. Well, who organized this tour?
And that's really a shame.
Yeah, well, that's a whole nother discussion.
That's a whole other
Are
discussion.
we going to ever have a meeting on players of the American Association that belong in the Hall of Fame? Pete Browning, obviously the most obvious one. Are we ever going to have that as a discussion?
Pete Browning was our very first overlooked legends selection. That's when everybody was on the list, and it was Deacon White and him had a very close finish that first year, and Pete Browning edged him out. And it's kind of interesting, that Browning has yet to be inducted, and it's that American Association thing, I think. Because when you look back in Spaulding's guides, you'll see a lot of subtle ridicule of the American Association. They'll always give a display when available of how many games the National League played against the association in exhibition and how many the National League teams won, which is always predominant. So I think they always had that kind of attitude. That prevailing attitude about the association.
Yeah, but Pete Browning joined the Players League in 1890, and he led the league, the Players League in batting that year. So obviously, and that was a lot of National Leaguers. So obviously, he would have flourished in the National League. Yeah, and he did when the American Association folded in 1891.
I think that was one of the major reasons he was picked when the committee voted back in. In 2009, I think was the first year we did it. And
he's still not in there yet. We got to get him in.
I noticed the mascot was in one of the pictures. You know how long he lasted on the tour?
Well, so the mascot you're talking about, Clarence Duval, is a story that I would have loved to get into, but it was going to put me over the time limit. But Clarence Duval, it's an amazing coincidence that he joined the tour. He joined them in Omaha, and he had before in Chicago he had briefly been a mascot for the White Stockings. And he did that for a couple days, and then he went back to his prior gig, which was with a woman named Vernona Jarbeau, who was a light opera singer, and Cap Anson talks about this in his autobiography in incredibly racist terms. I know it's jumping on the bandwagon to be anti-Cap Anson with the racism thing, and you can argue whether he was just reflecting his times, but the point is that he was overtly racist, and certainly in his language. But by dumb luck, amazing dumb luck, Vernona Jarbeau and Clarence Duval were in Omaha when the tourists happened to go through Omaha, and the rest of the ball players loved Duval, and so they asked him to join the tour, and Anson was just dead set against this. But he did, and he traveled around the world with them, and they, you know, if you look at the pictures, you'll see him here and there. But they did some terrible things to him. They when they got to some countries that had not seen someone as black as that, they put him in a catcher's mask with a leash, and they paraded him about as almost as a strange animal. It was quite horrific, the kind of things that happened. But he went around the world with them, and it was just an amazing coincidence.
That wouldn't play very well today, now would it?
No, that wouldn't. No, I don't think so.
It's too bad he didn't keep a diary.
Yeah.
So they had catcher's masks back then?
Sure. Yeah. Catcher's masks came along.
Maybe some of those guys that raided the Capitol, maybe they would think in those terms.
See, we've gone in that direction.
I know politics.
Let me close a comment that came up from James Chikulski that on Long, that he was just filling in for Ward till Ward could join the group in Denver.
Right. Thanks for pointing that out. That's right. Because they were short some players who they didn't know they were going to be in the World Series against the Browns. So Ward was one, and I can't remember the other guy that
probably
Cannonball Crane.
That probably happened because Long was from Chicago, so he was right there.
He's a known quantity.
They could avail themselves of his talent without any problems.
Yeah, it's hard to say no. Hard to say no to the boss. King Kelly can get away with it. Of course, King Kelly left. They sold him shortly thereafter. So, yeah.
I really like the banquet scene in Hawaii. I thought that was really amazing. To seeing the giant fish and they're all sitting on the ground, and the torches going, and the giant fish on the table. It's pretty amazing.
One of the interesting things about those color plates in that book, Athletic Sports, is, as I recall, every single color plate regarding the tour is based on a photograph, except for that one. And either that means there's a photograph that I am not familiar with and I've never found it, or indeed that was never a photograph. It was just a drawing, because it would have been nighttime, which would have been, they would have had to use, the light would have been problematic. But in the back of my mind, I always wondered if there's a photo that is obscure or completely lost of that luau. But it's a beautiful picture, isn't it?
I think all the royalty is at the one end of the table, right, with the sashes on and all that. And then I think probably Spalding is in the middle of the royalty. I'm not sure, but.
Okay, I'm sure he would have inserted himself right next to the king. There's no question that's what Spalding would have done.
Hey, Tom, that book that you pulled the plates from, is that in good condition? The plates, the colors look very crisp and vibrant.
Yeah, that's actually. I think I scanned a copy from a book that's in our collection because I wanted it to be kosher. I want to be able to tell everybody that everything is from the Hall of Fame. But this is my personal copy, and it's very beat up. These things are I don't know how many. It's probably about $500 now, something like that. But the color plates, the good thing about a book is your color plates are often well preserved, because your book, you don't display it open. And so you have less of a light issue. You have some level of oxidation, but it's pretty minimal. So color plates and books do pretty well.
Okay.
Right.
Any other comments? We'll hang up for this evening if there's no other comments.
Thanks, everybody, for showing. Appreciate it.
Can I see you guys next month?
Thanks for joining us.
Presentation.
Bye.
Thanks, Peter, for giving me the information. I really enjoyed it.
So did I.
Okay.